So the other day, this article popped up in my feed titled, "As Yu-Gi-Oh! Prepares to turn 25, the card game has never felt more welcoming for newcomers." We sure about that? I only skimmed the article, but I thought this would actually be some good content to react to and just give my 2 cents, because the way that this seems to be going, especially given the current discourse surrounding card prices, I'm not sure if this article was written like a couple months back and is now being published, but I think this will be a good read. Ample digital offerings, wide card availability, and a healthy competitive scene have helped the TCG put its best foot forward a quarter century in. Oh, this is going to be good. Can I just start off by saying I love that they chose this picture of Japanese Yu-Gi-Oh cards that are like some of the newer ones, because to most people, this is what Yu-Gi-Oh looks like. To people like us who actually play Yu-Gi-Oh, like, this is fine. But to anyone else outside of the Yu-Gi-Oh space, it just looks like complete gibberish. So I think this picture is already setting the tone for what's to come. Having recently picked up an analog pocket, stumbling upon a copy of one of the old Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship video games in the process, the 2006 edition specifically, I felt a wave of nostalgia rush over me. The game was released during the peak of my childhood obsession with the card game, long before the responsibilities of age made it difficult to reconnect with this love until many years later. Booting the game felt like a time capsule as I glanced at the decks my childhood self had built on that cartridge. The game represented the days where Yu-Gi-Oh! Felt not just exciting, but accessible for everyone, a relic from the final moments of the pre-archetype era that made it simple for anyone to pool their cards together for a competitive or casual duel with friends or strangers alike. So we can already see where the author's coming from, right? You know, like me, they're probably just a boomer when it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh! And they appreciate the golden age of, you know, before archetypes really existed, and you could just pick up whatever playground staples you had and just play a game with friends. I think that's the Yu-Gi-Oh! That a lot of people remember from their childhood, and so it makes sense, especially given that this is, what, 2006, so we're talking about a post-GOAT format, like post-Reaper format time, which was actually a lot of fun for a lot of people, because this is right before like Teledad and all that nonsense as well. So that was a pretty good time to be playing Yu-Gi-Oh! As Yu-Gi-Oh! Got more complex, this changed, and the growing complexity was one of the reasons my childhood self lost interest in the game. Beyond a spell of play during the early 2010s, it took almost a decade to find the time to dedicate to the TCG once again. Even by the time nostalgia fueled this return, those same concerns over complexity and accessibility remained, the introduction of pendulums and the beginning of Link Monster era once again appending the conventions of the game. I like the subtle nod to Edison format, saying beyond the spell of play during the early 2010s, because obviously with Edison being the most popular retro format now, that's just hilarious. But I also feel that pendulums and Link Monsters specifically were just kind of the final straw for a lot of people when it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh! Honestly, Synchros and Xyz were the final straw for a lot of people too, because that represented just a fundamental change of Yu-Gi-Oh! As a whole. But pendulum summoning specifically really rubbed people the wrong way, just because it was a drastic escalation in complexity when the cards themselves just took a major departure from what Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards are. But at the end of the day, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is one of the most ridiculous card games there is, and that's part of like the appeal. But I can also understand that from a complexity perspective, there is a point where I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Just becomes the most complex card game, just solely based on the fact that there's so many different summoning mechanics and there's just so much going on that's also not even just printed on the cards themselves, that it is a turnoff for a lot of people. For all the complexities remain a constant factor, this intimidating distance between newcomers and the joy of playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Has shrunk considerably. In fact, looking back on many of the releases from 2023 as we look ahead to a tentpole anniversary year for the game, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has never been more welcoming and accessible to newcomers as it feels today. I want to reserve my judgment here, but I've agreed with just about everything the author has said up until this point. But in terms of Yu-Gi-Oh! Has never been more welcoming and accessible to newcomers as it feels today, I think that is a highly subjective framework to be basing this article on, but I want to reserve judgment until we see what arguments they present. This is the result of a change in approach that we covered throughout last year and comes from a dedicated attempt to revitalize the game and encourage new audiences, both old and young, to not just try Yu-Gi-Oh! But enjoy their experience enough to stick around afterwards. It's a process that first began during the 2010s with the release of various companion games for mobile and other devices, starting with the release of Duel Links and the speedier, simplified physical format of Speed Duel. I want to take a brief aside right here and share a personal philosophy I have with Yu-Gi-Oh! Where Yu-Gi-Oh! Has this identity crisis issue where Konami, for some reason, feels the need to trick people into playing Yu-Gi-Oh! By not actually playing Yu-Gi-Oh! They almost just use Yu-Gi-Oh! As the skin for whatever game they're trying to produce to basically sell people on the game. You can take this concept all the way back to some of the very first Yu-Gi-Oh! Games that ever existed, right? I mean, look at games like Forbidden Memories or Dungeon Dice Monsters or just all these bizarre games, Capsule Monster Coliseum, and like Duelists of the Roses, Falsebound Kingdom, like all of these old games that are Yu-Gi-Oh!, but it's not actually playing the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game. It's like chess, but Yu-Gi-Oh! Or it's like some other weird game, but it's Yu-Gi-Oh! Themed. And that issue still exists even in modern times, but like even as you go throughout the different years of all the different Yu-Gi-Oh! Games that existed, like the Sacred Cards or all of these other older Game Boy games and such, I don't know why it's so difficult for a Yu-Gi-Oh! Game to just be Yu-Gi-Oh! And the author alluded to the World Championship games, which were what they were. It was Yu-Gi-Oh! It was clean cut, just one-on-one Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is what a lot of people wanted. And so when it comes to Speed Duel and Duel Links specifically, yes, they're still Yu-Gi-Oh!, but there's still gimmicks to them that don't make them like the actual card game. And that's not to say that people still can't enjoy those alternative formats, but it's just bizarre to me that a card game as popular as Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't lean into the fact that people want to play the actual card game, and instead we have to release all of these other, like, peripheral games just to keep people in the ecosystem of Yu-Gi-Oh! It's just bizarre. We've talked about the uncertain existence of the physical incarnation of the format during COVID in the past, but the success of Duel Links' mobile game is undeniable. Far from being nothing more than a healthy revenue stream for Konami as a company, the game brought with it a cohort of new and returning players enthused by the bite-sized experience the game offered. Many even made the jump to the physical edition of Speed Duel, a mode that has felt at least partially bolstered by the return of in-person competition. While far dwarfed by tournaments for the main game, the existence of Speed Duels as side events at YCS tournaments and remote duel events alongside the consistent launch of new reasonably priced products has cultivated a dedicated community of players supportive of this new alternative way of play. So there's no denying that Duel Links is incredibly profitable for Konami, because if you think about it, they're already taking assets that they've already created, digitizing them, releasing them, and cherry-picking them in a way that they see fit, and then also making it that with all the gacha mechanics that you're going to have to spend hundreds if not thousands of dollars to acquire the new cards, especially the way that they come out, that you actually need them that way, that they're going to make an absolute shit ton of money off of that. And so Speed Duel, I think, is a little bit more generous in this regard, just because with Speed Duel, a lot of the product is pretty self-contained. And when it comes to Speed Duel and Duel Links, though, the issue is sort of what I was alluding to before, right? It's Yu-Gi-Oh!, but Yu-Gi-Oh! Light, if you want to look at it that way. I mean, you only have the 3 zones for everything. There's the skill cards, which the skill cards are a whole nother discussion because they completely just bypass, like, complete entire mechanics of certain decks or archetypes, which arguably in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Would make those strategies unplayable. And so for Duel Links or Speed Duel specifically, actually allows these types of strategies to be played, but it's sort of like some weird, cheeky cop-out as a result. But then you also have the fact that you're playing Yu-Gi-Oh!, at least in the instance of like Speed Duel, right? You're playing Yu-Gi-Oh! That is like how people would have played the game back in like the early or rather late 2000s or maybe early 2010s. I know Duel Links obviously has more of the summoning mechanics because Duel Links is a lot older compared to Speed Duel, but at the end of the day, this is sort of just channeling what people really liked about old Yu-Gi-Oh! And just repackaging it, rebranding it, and trying to appeal to that audience. But again, I don't understand why we have to have this separation between the two. I guess you could argue that from an accessibility standpoint, yes, it allows people to play Yu-Gi-Oh!, but if you're looking at Yu-Gi-Oh! Top-down, the main game of Yu-Gi-Oh!, this is not people playing the main game. This is people playing like a side product, which I guess is still inclusive of the overall Yu-Gi-Oh! Community, but I think it's a bit unfair to say that you're trying to use this as a segue to say that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is very inclusive as a whole, because I just don't think that's true. Also, when it comes to Duel Links specifically, I mean, when it comes to like this product here, the Speed Duel GX box, this is fantastic because you can just buy one of these, get some friends, and you have like a whole draft experience. This is arguably like one of the best products ever made for pick up and play Yu-Gi-Oh, which is something that arguably this game has had an issue with. And I think a lot of card games struggle with to a degree. Yu-Gi-Oh specifically, like a lot of people want to say, yes, you can just buy some structure decks and then you have a deck that you can play. Sure, but in the context of a modern competitive format, that deck is not nearly going to be enough. In very rare instances, maybe, but for the most part, it's not going to be enough to compete with the other strategies at play. With the GX box specifically, or any of the Speed Duel box products, I think they've had the GX box and the Battle City box at this point, these products are meant to be played almost sort of like a board game where there's 8 different decks that you can sort of mix and match things if you wish, and you get a couple friends, you have the box, you share it, and you just play it as a self-contained product. So it's almost like a board game in that regard. And I think that's fine at the end of the day for getting people to play Yu-Gi-Oh, but I still think it's a separation between that and modern Yu-Gi-Oh, which is what Yu-Gi-Oh is today. Duel Links, on the other hand, and I'm not sure if the article will get more into detail about Duel Links, but Duel Links, alternatively, you have to spend, there's a free-to-play element, of course, like all games have nowadays, but when it comes to Duel Links specifically, you're having to spend maybe as much as if you'd be playing the modern TCG for an entire digital collection that you can't even resell on the secondary market to get out of the game itself. So in that sense, it's not nearly as accessible because you're sort of locked in with what you get. For those looking to get into the game, which I assume they're talking about the GX box, remains the cheapest way to get into the game. 2 sets containing 4 decks, each and everything you need to play, were launched in 2023 at under £25 per box, and Konami has already committed to at least one more set in 2024. The reliance on nostalgia with beloved characters as skills and a generally older card pool is no coincidence either, encouraging lapsed players back into the game for a cheap transitional path back to the main game or a casual way to play the game without being put off by the commitment necessary for main events. What I find interesting about this paragraph, and I understand that the Speed Duel boxes came prior to what I'm about to say, so maybe that could partially be responsible for what's at play here, but with the release of the Time Wizard events and the Ultimate Time Wizard events that take place at YCSs, where retro formats are actually being encouraged and embraced at the moment, so that if you want to play an alternative way of Yu-Gi-Oh, it's still at its core Yu-Gi-Oh in a snapshot of time that isn't diverging from what Yu-Gi-Oh is at its essence. Again, Speed Duels is still Yu-Gi-Oh, but it's a variation and a different way to play Yu-Gi-Oh, where hypothetically, GOAT format and Edison format, which are the 2 most popular retro formats, are actual snapshots of Yu-Gi-Oh in their respective timelines, 2005, 2010, and you're still playing Yu-Gi-Oh at its core. You're not adding any other supplementary gimmicks. You're not taking things away. You're not starting at half life points. It's still Yu-Gi-Oh! And so that sort of begs the question from me, is that if we're at a point now where we're seeing this rise in popularity of these alternative formats, where is like the GOAT format draft box? Where is the Edison format draft box? I think that would be an incredibly popular product given the rise in popularity of all these alternative formats. And that way you're not having to package it as being a completely separate format. It can still be packaged as Yu-Gi-Oh, not Yu-Gi-Oh Speed Duel, not Yu-Gi-Oh whatever. It's just Yu-Gi-Oh, and you're giving reprints to players as well for those respective formats because some people are actually priced out because those cards haven't been reprinted in like 10 or 15 years. I think there's a lot of potential there. And so it's just strange that, once again, Konami is relying on the nostalgia to repackage Yu-Gi-Oh in a different way than just embracing and leaning into the fact that Time Wizard formats are incredibly popular. The retro formats that are the self-contained formats that people played before is what people actually want, and just send that. I can also say from experience from attending YCS level events, you do not see the Speed Duel events firing off nearly as much as you do for something like the Time Wizard Edison pods, for instance. Now, again, I want to be a bit fair here because I'm pretty sure these products came prior to Time Wizard format even existing and being something that Konami wanted to even start launching in the first place. So maybe we are seeing that transition here. But in any case, I still think it's a valid argument that we should be giving people the actual retro Yu-Gi-Oh! And if you're going to lean into nostalgia, go that path instead of this. But that doesn't take away from the fact that the GX box is still an insanely popular product, and I still think it's a solid product altogether. It's a mode that remains under question due to its lower popularity and the success of Rush Duel in Japan, in particular with the recent introduction of Rush Duel internationally in English for the first time following its introduction to Duel Links as an additional mode. Yet the continued affirmation of this cheaper entry point is worth celebrating, and an uptick in events in 2023 coinciding with the full-scale reintroduction of in-person events is a signal of intent that the company intends to retrain a cheaper entry point going forward, regardless of which format becomes the priority moving forward. I definitely agree that, especially surrounding the recent price discourse when it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh! Prices in general, that there does need to be cheaper onboarding entry paths for people to play the game, not only just like with their friends, but even like at a higher competitive level. But I also think that the argument could be made that they could be doing it in a much different way that could be more productive overall and also more sustainable at the same time. I'm just saying, if they make the Edison draft box, I'm probably going to buy 10. The announcement of Rush Duel's introduction to Duel Links came to last year's Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championships. It was an event that not only signaled the grand return of the centerpiece of the competitive calendar streamed worldwide for audiences on YouTube and Twitch, but affirmed the company's commitment to reaching players where they are rather than forcing players to come to them in order to compete. This was the first year a World Championship and the mega hit free-to-play Master Duel was crowned, joining Duel Links as the second digital crown awarded at the event. Rush Duel is another example of a Yu-Gi-Oh! Skinned game that isn't actual Yu-Gi-Oh! And for those who've never played it, it only recently just came to Duel Links at the time of recording this video. And if you've never seen Rush Duels or played Rush Duels or even seen a Rush Duel card, it's Yu-Gi-Oh! At a fundamental level, but it plays completely differently for so many reasons. You're able to summon multiple times in a turn. Well, I mean, you can do that in regular Yu-Gi-Oh!, but you're able to draw 5 cards every single turn, and it has different types of summoning mechanics. And again, it's Yu-Gi-Oh!, but also not. And so, again, we're taking this bizarre detour away from Yu-Gi-Oh! Itself. And I know, obviously, it's supposed to follow the Rush Duel anime and things like that, but it's just weird. Like, why do we need to have all of these different types of Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards that don't even all coincide with the main game itself? Because you have regular Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, you have Speed Duel Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, which you can use Speed Duel Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards in regular Yu-Gi-Oh!, but you can't use regular Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards in Speed Duel. And then you have Rush Duels, which technically don't even have cards that are in US printings or any non-Japanese printings as far as I'm concerned. So the only real way to play with those, but like, why do we have all these different cards? Like, let's just play with our Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards. With Duel Links and Master Duel come not just a new legion of champions whose history with the game differs from their TCG counterparts, but offer a new way for those TCG veterans to compete in new ways that keeps the game fresh. Everyone on Team Snipe Hunters has extensive TCG experience prior to Master Duel Championship glory, while Joshua Schmidt won the most recent YCS Bologna just months after the championship crowning Master Duel escapades. I will say that there's no denying the power that Duel Links and Master Duel, but I actually want to say more so Duel Links in this regard, just because Duel Links has been around for a lot longer, have contributed to getting people back into playing Yu-Gi-Oh! In some capacity. And sure, I have been arguing this entire time that they are different from the actual competitive, like what Yu-Gi-Oh! Is today. But I've talked with so many individuals who said they started by picking up Duel Links because in terms of accessibility, you just download the app, right? I mean, and it is free to play up into an extent, but it sort of gives you your first dose of cardboard crack. And then once you start getting back into it, then they're going to start picking up actual cards and start going to locals and competing. And so it sort of starts the cycle. And so Duel Links is responsible for getting a lot of people playing again. And Master Duel, I feel like, is just a better iteration of Duel Links in that regard because it's the closest digital platform that does resemble actual modern Yu-Gi-Oh! In a lot of ways. Granted, there are still some differences, and I'm sure we'll get into that in a moment. But in terms of accessibility from that perspective, I definitely think we are in a golden age in terms of allowing people to play the game physically or digitally. There are a multitude of ways to access the game. Notably, while both games have extensive microtransactions, these are free-to-play titles that have garnered huge fan bases precisely because they offer a free introduction to the game. It gives players a taste of what Yu-Gi-Oh! Can be for those who give the game a chance, encouraging many to make the jump to the physical TCG as a result. That's literally what I just said. I guess I should have read ahead before I said anything. I suppose that brings up an interesting point with Master Duel specifically, though, because a lot of people argue that because Master Duel is its own self-contained format that differs from both the TCG and the OCG, it begs the question that if both platforms are incredibly successful at onboarding people from digital to physical, why would you not just lean into that as much as possible and full send giving people the TCG, the OCG, and then you can keep the Master Duel format? I think that's perfectly fine, but I don't know why you wouldn't allow people to pick and choose which format they want to play, and that way enhance their experience, because if they want to just practice for TCG, they can play TCG. If they want to experience what the OCG format is like, if you're a TCG player, you can try out the OCG format and vice versa. But if you solely want to focus on the Master Duel with like the Duelist Cups and such to be able to try to compete for the World Championship, then you play in the Master Duel format. It doesn't seem that complicated. Maybe there's this inherent fear on Konami's part that if they have Master Duel mimic TCG's format, or even OCG's format for that matter, or both, and you can pick and choose, that people aren't going to buy the physical cards, because why would you buy the physical cards when you could just play digitally, and arguably it would be at a different cost. But I would argue that someone who's not going to directly buy product from Konami or a store anyway, they actually get to capitalize on the fact that they would be buying those cards in Master Duel to be able to play on Master Duel. And so, I don't know. I feel like it's a bit of misguided logic to assume that people just wouldn't play both, especially when we know that Duel Links and Master Duel have been so successful in getting so many people back into the physical TCG. Of course, all of these examples are merely continuation of ongoing trends, even if the World Championship succeeded at giving them a platform to showcase themselves to a larger audience. The physical Speed Duel format launched in 2019, Duel Links launched in 2016, and Master Duel launched in 2022. Video games that offered digital duels or new playstyles existed in 2005 when I threw my hands into the Classic World Championship GBA title, and it wasn't the franchise's first foray into gaming either. We've definitely deviated from the old days of Yu-Gi-Oh! Trying to be anything except what it is, that's for sure, and Master Duel I think is the closest realistically we're probably ever going to get to like the best first-party simulator when it comes to the actual Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game specifically, and obviously there is still plenty of room for improvement, but I'm failing to see Master Duel 2 coming out anytime soon, where they can just keep improving on what they already have. Even if these experiences did bring new players to the game and offer an accessible entry route into playing Yu-Gi-Oh! For many, how does this explain why 2023 in particular was a more accessible year for those wanting to give Yu-Gi-Oh! A chance? Beyond the return of an uninterrupted competitive circuit and the community of card shops for in-person competition, that is. This comes from the commendable actions taken by Konami. This comes from the commendable actions taken by Konami. I'm sorry, I need to read this again. This comes from the commendable actions taken by Konami to accelerate moves to democratize and lower the financial cost of entry to competitive TCG Yu-Gi-Oh! For those looking to take the plunge. I'm reading this correctly, yes? Commendable actions taken by Konami to democratize and lower the financial cost of entry to competitive TCG Yu-Gi-Oh! For those looking to take the plunge. I'm sorry, I just had to repeat that again. Anyway, in other years, it would be understandable for a person to express interest in playing, only to balk at the... It would be understandable for a person to express interest in playing only to balk at the high cost of initial investment in building a deck that can compete with the best in the game. This issue has been addressed in a few ways. Okay, I'm in. Reprints are one obvious avenue improving the financial state of the game for new players. I agree. The 25th Anniversary Rarity Collection has set a new standard for how to make the core cards of the game more accessible through multi-rarity print runs and card selection. Structure deck releases have similarly included not only common reprints of staple cards used across all decks due to their versatility, but have stood out in comparison to prior years for their strength. The recent reloaded Fire King structured... They could not have picked a worse example with it. The recent reloaded Fire King structure deck is a particularly impressive release, promising a deck that can compete in tournament events just by picking up 3 copies of the deck and merging them together. Okay. We made it through this section. I have a lot to say here. Okay. So for those who are not in the loop and are watching this, we are currently going through a very turbulent time in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where some of the strongest in-engine cards you need to play the game are adding up to approximately $1,000. And that is before you even add in the in-archetype necessary cards to play whatever deck it is that you are actually playing. We're talking about the Sinful Spoils package. We're talking about SP Little Knight. We're talking about Bonfire. All of these cards that have been recently coming out, or even yet to come out, because we still have the Snake Eyes cards and Promethean Fire Princess, which is going to be released in Phantom Nightmare, which at the time of recording this hasn't been released yet, but considering we're looking at a potential Tier 0 format, those cards are most likely going to be rarity upgraded from the OCG and be even more expensive over here in the TCG as a result of that, especially because of their high demand, that we're already looking at $1,000 plus for like what is basically going to be one of the only playable decks if you want to play from a competitive perspective. And I understand that depending on when you jump into competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, that it's volatile and sometimes it might be a more diverse format where there's more options for what decks you can play and such. But even if you look back and like retrace the past couple years of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, it's still been pretty damn expensive regardless of what deck you've been playing, because whether it's specific pot cards, depending on the type of deck that you're playing for the added consistency with cards like Pot of Prosperity, whether it's specific in archetype cards that were released in core sets and only had a singular printing, like some of the specific planet field spells like Perlarino for your Tear Element strategies and such, or any of the other cards that were printed at high rarity that hadn't yet been reprinted because due to the time lapse and how long it takes to sometimes reprint these cards, competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Still definitely has a steep price tag attached to it. Now, all that said, the 25th anniversary rarity collection and, to an extent, the Fire King structure deck have done a good job of reprinting a lot of these competitive staple type cards, making them a lot more affordable to the masses. We're talking about any of the hand traps that you might see that are commonly played, like Ash Blossom and such. I'm pretty sure like Infinite Impermanence, you know, your Called by the Graves, all these cards that you might use across a myriad of different strategies that are pretty interchangeable, that are outside of the main core of what it is that your specific decks might require, right? We're also, when it comes to the Fire King structure deck, and not even just the Fire King structure deck, some of the other structure decks in years past, eventually they will take a high rarity staple card such as Ash Blossom and throw it into a structure deck like this. Ash Blossom has been reprinted in structure decks before. It was reprinted all the way back in the Soul Burner structure deck, which is, I want to say, 4 or 5 years old now at the time of recording this video. So it's not like Ash Blossom has never been reprinted up until this point. But point being is that Konami could do a better job at reprinting the cards maybe in a more timely manner to make them more accessible. But at the same time, it's counterintuitive to Konami's business model because that's also how they make money, because if the in-chase high-demand cards are going to be at the higher rarity end of the spectrum and they're in the sets where that's the only way to really obtain them, then that's how they're going to get a bunch of people to buy them, and then that's going to keep the demand high. And it's just a giant convoluted mess. I could go on and on. I'm obviously trying to stick within the scope of the article, but I think the timing of this article is of particular interest, considering that we're not often at a time where it's this expensive to be jumping into competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! But I think this is just very poor timing considering the circumstances of what is exactly happening right now in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community. And I think that's a bit unfortunate given the circumstances. I would even argue that this part right here, for a person to express interest in playing only to balk at the high cost of initial investment in building a deck that can compete with the best in the game, I would even argue that even if we're not on the perspective, you know, front end of seeing a tier 0 format or a very like limited narrow format of only being like 1 or 2 decks that are playable, I would even argue that even in a diverse format where there's several decks that are playable, I think the majority of people will continue to balk at the high cost of initial investment, because for a lot of individuals, investing even a few $100s into a competitive deck is extraordinarily expensive and something that people don't want to do, which is why they may not take the leap into competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Other games, for instance, don't have this issue nearly as much, but it's different because those games are structured differently, they're managed differently, the way their cards are released into the ecosystem is drastically different than what Yu-Gi-Oh! Does. At the bare minimum, I mean, set rotation exists, right? Like, that's enough to just sort of keep the price of some things in check. I mean, take a look at Pokemon. If you want to play competitive Pokemon, the decks aren't nearly as expensive as they are if you want to play Yu-Gi-Oh! And so again, if you're a fan of card games and maybe you like both Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh, if you're really wanting to take up the mantle and start playing one of them competitively, then if you look at the entry point in terms of picking up a competitive Pokemon deck, let's say you're buying everything secondhand versus a Yu-Gi-Oh deck at any given moment, I think if you're going based solely on price, Yu-Gi-Oh is going to lose out most of the time. Unless your love for Yu-Gi-Oh really overshadows your love for Pokemon, then that's just a scenario where Yu-Gi-Oh is never really going to win. I also feel like the 25th anniversary collection is also a major black swan event when it comes to the Yu-Gi-Oh TCG as a whole, because they can't sustainably continuously print rarity collections every single year, because eventually they're going to print so many copies of these cards, especially if it's the ones that are the highest in demand, that they are going to drive the prices of those cards into the ground. And you might think that that's a good thing, but I would argue it's not, because then that means the product itself doesn't hold value. If the product doesn't hold value, if they release it to the distributors and the card stores to then sell it to the players, the card stores and anyone who's selling the initial sealed product isn't going to make any money on it. And then as a result of that, they're going to take a huge loss. They're not going to want to reorder it, because then the confidence in the product goes down to zero, which means then they're not going to order from the distributors. And then essentially it's going to erode all confidence in the market. And so it's a very fine dance that has to be played when it comes to like reprinting cards. And I mean, with the 25th anniversary collection, we gave a lot of these cards, like 7 different printings. And if you look over here, Ash Blossom with all of its different printings now, courtesy of the Rarity Collection, it's still like $3 a copy, which is insane, all things considered. There's also the argument of, when it comes to reprinting some of these cards, how useful they are to being reprinted for the people who are considering entering the competitive landscape, right? Because while, yes, they just reprinted stuff like Ash Blossom and all of these common staple cards that have been part of Yu-Gi-Oh! I mean, Ash Blossom is how old now? Like 2016, so it's like an 8-year-old, 9-year-old card. When it comes to these cards, they've been around for quite some time, and they've been a part of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! For years, but they may dip in and out of formats depending on whether or not the cards are actually useful or not. That's the issue isn't with necessarily reprinting some of these other cards, because even prior to the Rarity Collection, going back to this, how many other printings of Ash Blossom have existed? Maximum Crisis was the original printing. It had Dual Devastator, Maximum Gold, Legendary Collection Kaiba, Shadows in Valhalla, Dual Power, Megatins, the structure decks, multiple, 1 structure deck, 2 structure deck, 3 structure deck, and then all of the versions of the 25th anniversary printing on top of all of that. And so there isn't an issue, I feel like, with these cards in particular. The issue is with the way that the financial model of card games exists in general, right? Because in order to keep people buying your product, there needs to be a degree of power creep to get people interested in buying the new cards, but also with the way Yu-Gi-Oh works specifically, because it's an eternal format, Yu-Gi-Oh needs to ban certain cards, so that way the decks that are considered the best decks at any given moment, after enough time has passed, then get knocked down a peg and are either not nearly as playable as they were before, or become completely unplayable because some of their best cards either get limited or banned to the point where the deck isn't consistent enough to play. So then new cards have to come in and fill that power vacuum, and specifically new cards, not just older cards, because if the new cards come and fill the power vacuum, that means people are going to go out and buy those new cards. And so it just creates this cyclical dynamic that, even if we get these massive reprint sets like the 25th anniversary collection, there's still going to be this disparity. Like, we just had the 25th anniversary collection, and everyone right now in the Yu-Gi-Oh community is complaining that Yu-Gi-Oh's too expensive. You would argue that the opposite would be true, and people are cheering in the streets that the game is as accessible as it ever has been, but in fact, the opposite is true. That's not to say reprints are bad or anything. Like, obviously, if more people have access to some of these cards, that's fine. But clearly, even with a massive... This is arguably the most colossally massive reprint set they've ever done in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Even with that, the game is still prohibitive from a cost perspective for the large majority of people who want to jump in on the competitive level. It's insane to think that Konami has released what is arguably the greatest reprint set of all time, and immediately after that, we are at a point where Yu-Gi-Oh is one of the most cost-prohibitive competitive formats we have seen in quite some time. Like, the divide is staggering. The Sacred Fire Kings in the deck center their effects around destruction, driven by the primary boss monster featured on the packaging, Sacred Fire King Garunix, a card which can special summon itself from the hand and further its combos by destroying monsters from the deck if successful. It makes things easier than ever for newer players, only helped by plans to release a new 2-deck starter set in January that allows you to team up with a friend and learn the ropes from 2 pre-built decks in a single set. This is sort of what I was alluding to earlier in the video when I talked about that the definition of Yu-Gi-Oh! Being accessible is entirely subjective, because accessibility how, right? If it's accessibility in terms of being able to play Yu-Gi-Oh!, I don't think Yu-Gi-Oh! Really has an issue with that necessarily. There are plenty of outlets for people to get their Yu-Gi-Oh! Fix, whether it's through like the true nature of like actual Yu-Gi-Oh! Or an alternative way to play Yu-Gi-Oh!, whether it's a retro Time Wizard format, whether it's Speed Duel, Duel Links, all of that. There's no accessibility issue in terms of actually playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Itself. Where the accessibility problems arise are from what seems to be a price perspective. And when we're talking about this 2-player starter set that's going to be released here soon, I think entry into the game itself is also a prohibitive issue that Yu-Gi-Oh! Continues to deal with. Yu-Gi-Oh!, in my opinion, is probably the most complex card game to play out of all of them, just because it has the steepest learning curve, because it's throwing so much at you at once if you are starting from ground zero. And a lot of people who start learning Yu-Gi-Oh! Typically start learning Yu-Gi-Oh! By playing older formats just to get a grasp of the fundamentals. You can teach people how to play old Yu-Gi-Oh! Formats like GOAT format, Edison, and such, because there isn't a ton of complexity going on there, and it really hones in on the fundamentals of, you know, normal summoning, a few special summons, setting cards, activating spells and traps, a lot of heavy emphasis on battle as well in the older formats, because, again, that's how you actually win the game. But newer Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a far cry from any of those older formats in the way that it's played, because there's so much going on. The cards have so much text, and there's so much complexity because so many cards have multiple effects, and sometimes so many things are adding up at a singular point that it can be overwhelming for a lot of players to really hop in and really get excited about a game like this. But that also plays to Yu-Gi-Oh!'s strength as well, because there's no other card game that really plays like Yu-Gi-Oh! Does in its modern state. And so I know they're releasing this starter set here in January at the time of recording this, but seeing some of the previews for the cards in the set, I don't exactly know how well this is going to act as an entry point to really get people into Yu-Gi-Oh! Because it's a really tall ask. Even Master Duel, with some of the single-player solo missions that you can play, even that is a difficult argument to get people into playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Because when you're playing throughout the tutorials or those solo missions, that's not like playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Against a regular opponent. And there's so many different cards, because there's over 10,000 cards in the game, that you're having to just learn so much at a single point. For people like me, or anyone who grew up, you know, essentially when the game was first released, or even grew up with the show for that matter, it was easier for us to transition into more complex versions of Yu-Gi-Oh! Because we grew up with the bare basic fundamentals of how to play. And so then when you throw in synchro summoning, when there's no other summoning mechanic, then it's like, oh, okay, you add the numbers, you make sure you have a tuner, that's not too difficult. And then once we get to Xyz summoning, which you have to remember, there's several years in between when synchro summoning and Xyz summoning were released, then it's like, oh, I take 2 monsters with the same level and put them on top of each other. That doesn't seem too difficult. But again, you're having several years to condition yourself and get used to this, versus someone who's entering Yu-Gi-Oh! In 2024. It's maddening, it's overwhelming, and it's unrealistic to expect that people are going to get excited about something like this when they watch someone do like a 40-card turn 1 combo, and they're gonna have no fucking clue what's going on. Also, I just have to say, can we stop printing vanilla monsters in starter products? We can print a starter product that has simple effect monsters, because actual Yu-Gi-Oh! Does not play vanilla monsters unless there's a very specific reason to play a non-effect vanilla monster. We need to completely abandon that old thinking. Like, if you're gonna teach people about normal monsters, like, make them play Evil Swarm or something, because at least there's a reason to play a normal monster in an Evil Swarm deck. I'm sorry. Coupled with the balance in the current metagame making more decks than ever a viable strategy for competitive glory, oh, this was not written recently, it gives players to the remit to play just about anything provided they have the strategy and skill to upset and overcome an opponent. It's a far healthier state of the game than ever. I gotta do this again. It's a far healthier state of the game than ever than seen towards the end of 22 and the start of 2023 when the domination of Kashtira and Terelement left little space for other decks to compete. Yeah, we're on the precipice of that happening once again, unfortunately, but it is what it is. With more competition comes a more level and exciting competitive game for newcomers and veterans alike, which can only be a good thing. I don't agree with that necessarily. Don't get me wrong. There are formats where you can play budget decks in terms of that they're like maybe tier 2 or roguish strategies that actually have a fighting chance against the best decks of any particular format. But there are very few instances where you can pick up a tier 1, and I'm talking about one of the best decks of the format for an affordable price, because that's just how the law of supply and demand works, unless the cards were introduced into the ecosystem in such a way that they aren't price prohibitive for a lot of people to be able to pick up. And so we've seen that in the past with some other strategies, but even so, like if they're structure deck based archetypes, like maybe for instance Salamangreat and Dinosaur, even those decks required specific other pieces in order to be played at the top levels of competitive play. But I will say it's not as bad compared to when the majority of the cards for a certain archetype or deck are released in core sets, because then a lot of the time they're going to be at the higher end of the rarity spectrum, which means the price for those cards is going to go through the roof. I would also argue that healthier state of the game is subjective here as well, because some people would argue that a more diverse metagame is healthier because more decks can be played, and to an extent, that could be true, but again, I feel like it's subjective. I think more competitive players would argue that more narrow formats where only a few decks are good, because then there's less other decks on the peripheral that need to be concerned about. And then if you're talking about strategy and skill, if it really comes down to who's the more skillful player, if there's less blowouts or less variance in terms of what you might encounter at a competitive level, then the more skillful player on paper should win more often than not. Which leaves us entering 2024 and the game's anniversary in the healthiest state Yu-Gi-Oh! Has enjoyed throughout its post-COVID existence. From a time when the game struggled, we can look back on the game's success and see a path forward for another 25 years. Nostalgic fans can enjoy the past via collectible releases and the Legendary Collection, and from that, feel capable of diving into the modern game in a way that was once too intimidating or expensive for many to fully enjoy. Ultimately, a game can't sustain itself on the goodwill of long-term players forever. A key stumbling block for Yu-Gi-Oh! Has been its lack of an entry point for new players. An anniversary year will naturally garner attention for the franchise, and the upcoming Tokyo Dome Showcase and celebratory releases are just the start of what promises to be a big year worthy of that increased scrutiny. This means nothing if the game can't capitalize on that to find new strength. For the first time in a long time, thanks to its digital and physical reforms, it feels like Yu-Gi-Oh! Is putting its best foot forward at the most crucial time. I think now that we've wrapped this article up, I want to just reiterate that I don't think from an accessibility standpoint, Yu-Gi-Oh! Suffers from actually getting people to play the game. Whether it's the way you like to play Yu-Gi-Oh!, I like to play Yu-Gi-Oh!, or your friends like to play Yu-Gi-Oh!, there's not an issue getting people to actually play Yu-Gi-Oh! In whatever form it is that they prefer to play. I think the larger issue stems from two issues. The two issues are actually onboarding newer players to get into the game because of the steep complexity curve, because of the fact that it's a 25-year-old game, and how do you balance keeping your hardcore audience of devoted fans happy and interested in the game while also simultaneously appealing to new players, whether you're trying to poach them from other card games or maybe appeal to an entirely different audience altogether, while not relinquishing or sacrificing what it is that makes Yu-Gi-Oh! What it is. But then also you have the fact that it's very price prohibitive for a lot of people, and I think that's something that Konami honestly has direct control over at the end of the day, because yes, obviously we have economics at play here when it comes to supply and demand and all that, but at the same time we can look to the OCG, which has a completely different rarity model and the distribution of the way that their cards are released. Most cards are affordable to the average player, and it's rare to see a card exceed somewhere in the neighborhood of like $35 to $40. That's considered expensive in the OCG. And Konami's aware of this. Konami knows that over in the OCG, that's their audience and that's what they're willing to spend on cards. Whereas in the TCG, they know that people are willing to spend way more. And so that's why we have artificial short printing. That's why we have all these different elements at play here that result in our market dynamics being a lot different than when it comes to Asia. And it's unfortunate because it feels like a lot of these things could be fixed. It feels like a lot of these things could be remedied in pretty sustainable ways moving forward. But I think at the end of the day, the profit motive is really just what's driving the decisions that they make. And they are a business at the end of the day, so it is what it is. It sucks too, right? Because I know that you and I love Yu-Gi-Oh! That's probably why you're watching this video, in all honesty. And you probably know how it feels when you want to share that love with other people that you know, to have them experience that same joy and love for the game that you do. But then when you, at the bare minimum, try to introduce them to the game, they just immediately look turned off because of how intimidating and overwhelmingly complex the game just appears. And there's all the hidden rules that aren't presented on the actual cards themselves that you have to memorize, and then don't even get into, like, you know, missing the timing and like all these other like complex mechanics. And then it just snowballs. And then, you know, that's where the core audience is at the end of the day. We were hooked from the beginning and we're still hooked now. That's why we're here. Overall, I think the article was fine. It made some valid points. There were some things that were completely misguided, but I also don't know how much of that was just due to the timing of when this article was specifically released and the way that the market conditions, specifically because of like what's happening in the competitive setting, have sort of converged at this exact moment when we're recording this video. But in any case, I mean, I just want Yu-Gi-Oh! To last as long as possible because this game's great. It's a lot of fun. And if there's any way that we can just continue to bring people into the game any easier and make it more accessible for people, I think that's something that we can all agree on. So thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and we'll see you next time.